Welcome to qiphyedu. Today we'll be looking at economics, AS level, paper 11, May, June 2023. Alright, let's start. Okay, so for the first question it says, what is a produced means of further production? Basically, what we are seeing here right now is it's basically the produced meaning the product. The item that is produced to further produce something. So that's the meaning of produced means of further production. The product is made to produce more products. Like you are building a machine, for example. You're building a machine to produce more machines. Alright, let's say this is M and this one is M1, M2, M3 and M4. So the produced product is used to further produce extra thousands of products. So that is basically what this entire phrase means. And the item that produces things, more things, would be machines, and machines are categorized under capital goods. And for these four options here, you see that A says capital, B says enterprise, C says labor, and D says land. Now land itself, all four of these are factors of production. But then for a produce that is used to produce more things, that will have to be capital, and that will be capital goods, and that will fall under answer A. B says enterprise. Enterprise is basically the entire company itself, and then it comprises of it comprises of people. Basically the enterprise uses land, uses labor, and also capital to produce the goods. So capital itself would only be referring to the machines, right? So answer would be A. Question 2. A hospital management board decides to reallocate $800,000 from its 1.2 million new buildings budget to spend on cancer care. So basically, a hospital decides to just take, supposedly $1.2 million is used to produce new buildings, but now 800,000 from it has been removed to spend on cancer care. So the opportunity cost would be the next best alternative foregone. The next best alternative foregone would be the best thing that you can do with that $800,000 that you have taken out for cancer treatment. So what would be the opportunity cost? The opportunity cost, like what I mentioned, the next best alternative. So let's look at the four options. A says a cost of 400,000, which is not correct, because a cost of 400,000 would be used to produce the buildings, but then the 800,000 will no longer be used. But that is not the opportunity cost. B says a cost of $800,000, which is also not correct. $800,000 is still there. It's just that it's no longer used to produce new buildings. And C says the cost of healthcare for cancer patients, which is incorrect, because the 800,000 is used to pay for the healthcare for cancer patients. So the answer will have to be D, the loss of some new buildings. So some buildings will not be built because only $400,000 is left to build those buildings, and $800,000 is used for something else. Question 3. The diagram shows the change in the country's production possibility curve from XX to YY, and what will explain this change? So you can see here for the PPC for XX, you see that there are more drinks compared to food, but then for PPC YY, you see that there are less drinks and more food. So PPC is basically the maximum combination. PPC shows the maximum combination of two goods that a country can produce given the resources available, and also given resources available. So you can see here the four options here. A says consumers chose to consume more food and less drink, which is incorrect. This one is a PPC curve. It shows the maximum combination of two goods that can be produced in an economy. So basically the amount that can be produced, and not the amount that a consumer purchases. So B, if you look at B, it says government tax food production and subsidize drink production, which is incorrect, because like what I mentioned here, you can see that this PPC is basically used to calculate the maximum combination of two goods that a country can produce given the resources available. So even if you tax food production and you subsidize drink production, if you do not have enough resources to produce these two goods, then it's also not possible to produce that certain amount of good. And this all depends on productivity of labor and also resources available. So D is not the answer here. C, it says productivity rose in food production and fell in drink production, which is correct. So that means that there are more food produced and less drinks produced. And D, it says there were more imports of food and more exports of drink, which is incorrect because like what I mentioned, this is the PPC. It's not showing the amount of inflow and outflow of goods into the country and also out of the country. So that's not the answer. Answer is C. Question 4. A factory manufactures chairs and the manufacturing process is divided into a number of tasks. And what is likely a disadvantage of this division of labor? So division of labor means that some workers would end up in this production process, some workers will end up in the second production process, some workers will end up in the third production process. They'll be doing the same thing over and over again. This would then increase productivity because over time, the workers are used to their jobs. They know how to they're used to their jobs, and then they'll be able to produce things at a much faster rate. So they'll be able to produce things in a shorter time. So there'll be an increase in productivity, and then there will be an increase in the quality of the product because the workers really they are already used to what they are doing, so they know how to maintain the quality of the items. Some of the workers who are assigned to do quality check, they will be able to know whether or not the item is of good quality or not. And then there will definitely be an increase in output because when there's increase in productivity, there will be an increase in output. But with this division of labor, it will also mean that you are doing the same thing over and over again, which means that you'll feel less satisfied with your job because you are doing the same thing over and over again. And then over time, when a person does something over and over again, their satisfaction will decrease and they will feel bored, and when they feel bored, they will then have a decrease in motivation. Therefore, answer would have to be A. Instead of the all other three, as you can see, decrease in output, productivity, and quality, which basically are complete opposites. Question 5. Which row correctly describes the relationship between two goods implied by the value of the cross elasticity of demand? So cross elasticity of demand, also known as XED, which will then show you which are complements and which are substitutes. So if they are substitutes, then the cross elasticity of demand has to be positive, and if it's negative, it has to be complements. And then for weak substitutes, it has to be less than 1 and more than 0. If it's strong, then it's more than 1. For complements, if it's a weak complement, it will be between negative 0 and negative 1. And then for for strong complements, it has to be negative 1 to negative 2. So let's look at the 4 options and see which one is the correct answer. As you can see, for A, the value of the cross elasticity of demand is negative 2.0, but it says that it is a weak complement. They are weak complements, which is incorrect because they are strong complements. So that's not the answer. B, it says negative 0.5, and it says weak substitutes, which is not correct because for negative 0.5, both of the goods should be weak complements. C, you can see for positive 0.5, it's both of them are weak substitutes, which is correct. But then D is positive 2.0, and it says strong complements, which is incorrect because it has to be strong substitutes instead of strong complements. So answer is C. Question 6. What does consumer surplus measure? So consumer surplus is basically the difference between what a consumer is willing to pay and what he or she actually pays for the product. So let's look at A. It says the excess profit earned by the producer of a good, which is basically not the answer. Okay. And B, because if you look at this graph, in order to calculate the consumer surplus, you take the maximum combination that a person is willing to purchase, the maximum amount that the consumer is willing to purchase and what he actually pays for it. So that's the difference for consumer surplus. If it's the excess profit earned by the producer, it has to be the producer surplus. It's not consumer surplus. B, it says the opportunity cost to the consumer not buying a good, which is incorrect. Like what I mentioned just now, consumer surplus is the difference between what a consumer pays for the good and also the what the consumer is willing to pay for it. C, says the price the marginal consumer is willing to pay for a good, which is not correct because if it's the price the marginal consumer is willing to pay for a good, it has to be here. it has to be on the top, and that is only a point and not the area. Consumer surplus would have to be an area that you'll be able to calculate in the graph. D says the consumers gain from purchasing a good at a price below what they are willing to pay, which is correct, because the gain would be when you take what you are willing to pay for the product and minus what you actually pay for it. So that will be the consumer's gain. Alright, so answer is D. Okay, for question 7, when the price of good X is $2, the quantity supply is 100,000. The price elasticity of supply of good X is 0.8 in the short run and 1.4 in the long run. The price of good X increases to $2.20, and what is the increase in the quantity supply of good X between the short run and the long run? So to calculate the price elasticity, to calculate the change in the quantity supply, you need to take this formula, which is the price elasticity of supply formula. So we know that in the long run, the price elasticity of supply is 1.4. We just put it down, and the percentage change in quantity supply. So we're gonna put it as unknown minus the original number, dividing the original number. And then for price, we know it increases to $2.20, so just take $2.20 minus 2 divided by the original number. So by doing this, we'll get 1.4, and then we'll take this x minus 100,000 divided by 100,000 divided by $2.20 minus $2, and we get, then divide by 2, you get 0.1. Then we just take 0.1 and we multiply by 1.4. You get 0.14, and then now we just move 100,000 to the top. Right. So we get 14,000 equals x minus 100,000. Then we now move 100,000 to the front, so x equals to 114,000. Alright, so now we're going to calculate the short run. So the short run is 0.8. And the same thing here, we just take the same formula. So x minus 100,000 divided by 100,000. And then 0.2 divided, 0.1 is 0.1. And then just take 0.1 times 0.8, we'll get 0.08. And then x minus 100,000 divided by 100,000, we move 100,000 to the top, multiply 100,000, we get 8,000. And here, I think we just change the variable to y, so that will be something like this. So then we can move 100,000 to the left, and that will give us 108,000 equals to y. We take 114,000 minus 108,000, we get 6,000, so answer here would be A. Alright. Question 8, the diagram shows the European market for diesel fuel, and the original equilibrium is at M. And Europeans want low emission cars, and therefore the demand for diesel fuel has decreased from D1 to D2. And which area represents the new producer surplus for companies supplying diesel fuel? So the demand for diesel fuel has increased from D1 to D2, from G to H. Okay, and then the original consumer surplus should be at point, this entire thing would be the original producer surplus. So then when it changes to D2 and H, that will be this point. And the new producer surplus would have to be H, N, and J. So, or J, H, and N. So answer would have to be C. Alright. Question 9. In which situation is the demand for a product said to be price elastic? So for demand to be price elastic, the price elastic demand would have to be more than 1. Okay. So it says the quantity demanded responds to a change in price. This is not correct, because if a product is if the demand for product is price inelastic, it is just less responsive, but it's still responsive. And if it's more than 1, then it's more responsive. So answer A is not correct. B, it says an increase in price brings about a decrease in quantity demanded, which is not correct. So an increase in price brings about a decrease in the quantity demanded. even if it's price inelastic, it's also the same. It's just that it is different compared to when it's price inelastic. C says an increase in price induces consumers to spend more on the product. Incorrect. A demand curve is downward sloping. The lower the price, the higher the quantity demanded. So that's not the answer. D says a decrease in price brings about an increase in revenue, which is correct, because if the demand for product is price elastic, when you decrease the price, it increases your revenue. So that would be when it's price elastic. So answer would have to be D. Sorry. Question 10. Golf club membership fees in Singapore have risen as a result of restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses in neighbouring countries and the closure of some local courses. The supply of golf club memberships is determined by the current number of courses. If the original agreement was an X, which point shows the result of these changes. Okay, so let's look at the question again. It says golf club membership fees in Singapore have risen as a result of restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses in neighbouring countries and the closure of some local courses. Okay, so closure of some local courses meaning that there's a decrease in supply, so it has to be from S1 to S2. And then golf club membership fees have risen as a result of restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses. Restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses. So for this one, it also says that the supply of golf club memberships is dependent on the current number of courses. So it didn't mention anything about demand. It's just mentioning that the fees have increased because of restrictions on travel. Restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses. Restrictions on travel to cheaper golf courses, so then it has increased. Closure meaning decrease in supply, and supply is determined by current number of courses. Therefore, there's nothing mentioning about demand, so answer has to be B. Right? Question 11, the diagram shows the demand and supply curves for solar energy in India. The initial equilibrium point is at X, and the Indian government increases the subsidy to solar energy producers. At the same time, there is a rise in the price of alternative sources of energy, and what is the new equilibrium position? So the Indian government increases subsidy to solar energy producers, which means there's an increase in supply. At the same time, there's a rise in the price of alternative sources of energy, meaning an increase in demand, so answer would have to be B. Alright, so there's a shift from the demand curve to the right, shift in the supply curve to the right. Right, question 12. A specific tax is placed on the sale of bottles of lemonade. In the diagram, S is the supply curve before imposition of the tax, and ST is the supply curve after tax, and which distance represents the specific tax on each bottle. So S is the supply curve before imposition of the tax, and T is the supply curve after tax. So the specific tax would have to be the difference between the price after tax and the price before tax, which means that we have to look at the quantity here. So quantity here is the axis that shows the same quantity but different prices would have to be this one, so it's between W and T. So the specific tax would have to be WT, which also means that the answer is B. Right, so that's the answer. Right. Question 13, demand for medical face masks exceeds supply during a disease outbreak. And what is the most likely cause of this excess demand? So most likely cause of this excess demand is basically when there's a disease outbreak, right, the demand is more than supply. And so if you look at the four options, A says some consumers do not have effective demand, which is incorrect. There is excess demand already, so it's effective. B says the demand for medical face masks is price inelastic in the short run, which is not the answer. And C says the price of medical face masks is fixed below the equilibrium price. D says the supply of medical face masks is inelastic in the short run. Okay, so demand for medical face masks exceeds supply. So this is your supply curve, this is your demand curve. If it exceeds supply, it would be something like this. So original equilibrium price will be here, but then your price is now at this position, which means that there is an imposition of a maximum price. So the answer will have to be C, where it says the price of medical face mask is fixed below the equilibrium price. Alright, that's the answer. Okay, for question 14, the diagram shows the demand and supply curves for a good. The government fixes a maximum price of OP1, and what would happen? Alright, so you can see here, it says maximum price of OP1, which is this point. And then the equilibrium is actually at this point, which is P. So let's look at the four options. A, it says consumers will have to be rationed to quantity OQ1, which is incorrect because there's no rationing that occurred because the price is still equilibrium. Maximum price meaning that you set the price higher, but it only can be limited to P1. But then this will result in a decrease in demand, which will only affect the firms. B says the government would have to introduce a subsidy of PP1, which is incorrect because it's already at equilibrium, so there's no need to do that. C says the market equilibrium quantity would be demanded and supplied, which is correct at OQ. D says the supply of quantity OQ2 would be guaranteed, which is incorrect because it's already at equilibrium point. So supply will not be guaranteed unless the minimum price is at P1. So answer is C. Question 15, which statement correctly describes absolute advantage? So A, it says it is when a country has a higher opportunity cost in producing a good than another country, which is incorrect. For absolute advantage, it has to be where it has low opportunity cost in producing a good. And B, it says it is when a country has a low wage cost in producing a good than another country. Let's look at C first. It is when the relative prices of exports of a country are greater than the relative prices of its imports. This is not absolute advantage. D says it is when a country's output of goods is greater per unit of resource than another country. So absolute advantage meaning that the output, they can produce higher output at a lower opportunity cost. So B, it says it is when a country has lower wage cost, which is not correct because that doesn't mean absolute advantage. D, it says it is when a country's output of a good is greater per unit of resource, which means that for that one unit you can produce more of an output compared to other countries. So that means that you can produce more using the same resources available. That means your efficiency is increased. So answer is D. Question 16, the table shows the income and wealth of Yasmin and what is the value of Yasmin's wealth. So wages would be your income, so this can be ruled out. And then dividend would be your income. Property owned is your wealth. Savings in bank is part of wealth. Shares is also your wealth. And then children's welfare benefits is not that's considered your income. Your wealth is basically what you own and not what you earn. So what you have would be your property, your savings, and also your shares that you own. So answer is 43,000 when you add up together. Question 17, which group is most likely to suffer during high inflation? So during high inflation, borrowers would be at absolute advantage because now they can use a lesser price to lesser amount to actually pay back, so they don't suffer. Importers would then okay, so if it's importers during high inflation, right, they would slightly suffer because they will now need to use a higher price to import. In C, it says producers they will need to use a higher price, but then they don't really suffer that much because they can still change the amount that they sell. But if it's fixed wage earners, then they will be affected the most because they have the same income, but then they are now only able to buy less of goods that they need for their daily use. So this one would be the answer. Question 18, which statement explains why the aggregate demand curve is downward sloping? So for aggregate demand curve, is something like that demand curve is when the prices fall, then there will be the quantity of the good will then increase. So A, it says as prices fall, the demand for exports become more elastic, which is incorrect. It's demand curve, AD curve. AD curve would be CIG plus X minus M. And then B, it says as prices fall, fewer goods are imported, which is incorrect. C, it says as prices fall, the real interest will rise, which is incorrect. If let's say you want to increase the rate of interest, when you increase the rate of interest, this will result in the aggregate demand curve to shift to the left, but it's not explaining why it is downward sloping. And then as prices fall, fewer goods are imported, which is incorrect. For aggregate demand curve, it's basically the price level and also the the total GDP of the country. So as prices fall, right, there'll be an increase in GDP, which then but that doesn't mean that there are fewer goods that are imported. You still need to import goods in order to produce items that that requires foreign resources. D says as prices fall, real wealth rises and so spending increases, which is correct. That's why the increase in GDP exists. Question 19, the diagram shows aggregate demand and aggregate supply for the economy. Which change in subsidies and indirect taxes will cause a change from AS1 to AS2? So AS1 and AS2 means that you can see the aggregate supply has now decreased, but the aggregate demand stays the same. Okay, so things that affect the aggregate supply would have to be subsidies, so subsidy would have to be lower, so A and B is wrong. And then if there's lower indirect taxes, that means that your aggregate supply will move to the right, but there's higher indirect taxes, so it will shift to the left, so I'll say C. Question 20, the graph gives the percentage unemployed for all people aged 16 and over and for young people aged 16 to 24. What is the consequence for consumer expenditure on products consumed by the 16 to 24 age group over the period of 2010 to 2020? You can see that for consequence of consumer expenditure on products consumed by group. You can see that in 2010, the percentage unemployed is at 26 or 27, and then for 2020 is at 19%. So it says a fall in consumer expenditure across the whole period, which is incorrect. There is an increase in consumer expenditure because the percentage unemployed actually drops and then increases slightly. B says an initial fall in consumer expenditure followed by a rise, which is incorrect. Because there is an initial fall, there is an increase in consumer expenditure because of the decrease in percentage unemployed. Then there is a decrease in consumer expenditure because there's a rise in unemployment. And C says an initial rise in consumer expenditure followed by a fall, which is correct. D says a rise in consumer expenditure across the whole period, which is incorrect. Rise in consumer expenditure will be like this. It will be like this. That doesn't exist here, so I'll say C. Question 21, in the diagram, the intersection of AD and LRS at point X represents the current macroeconomic equilibrium, and which point could represent the new equilibrium after the introduction of an increase in the retirement age, which means that there will be more production of goods and all those. That means that there will be an increase in aggregate demand. And then there is also an increase in the long run aggregate supply, so answer will have to be C. Question 22, this question, right, it is there's an issue with the question, so we'll just skip this based on the answer sheet. Question 23, the diagram shows production possibility curves for two countries, India and Japan, and which combination of outputs would be achieved if each country specialized in the product in which it has a comparative advantage. For Japan, right, you can see that it's able to produce 200 tea or 500 rice, whereas for India, you can produce 600 rice and 200 tea, which means that Japan has a slight disadvantage when it comes to producing rice. So rather than actually producing rice, Japan should just focus on producing tea instead. So for question 23, right, there's no other answer than 200, so B and D is out of the question. And for rice, right, it has to be the one country that can produce the most, so that'll be India, so that'll be 600, so answer is A. Question 24, country's currency has depreciated against all the currencies of its main trading partners, and how will the depreciation affect its terms of trade? So a country's currency has depreciated, meaning that it is now you need to pay more in order to buy imported goods. So A says the terms of trade will now improve. Terms of trade would have to be the price of exports relative to your price of imports. So your price of exports will now become relatively lower, will become relatively higher. Your terms of trade would have to be when it's more than, if for terms of trade to improve, it has to be more than 100. It has to be more than 100. So price index, it has to be more than 100. So if let's say your price has increased, your price of exports has now decreased, you will then put yourself at a disadvantage because your terms of trade would then decrease to less than 100, which means that you will not improve. B says the terms of trade will not change. C says the terms of trade will worsen, which is correct because your price of exports will now be relatively lower compared to your price of imports. Now price of imports will be more expensive, so terms of trade will now worsen, and then your number will be less than 100. Alright, Question 25. A country with floating exchange rate experiences a large surplus on the current account of its balance of payments, and what is likely to decrease as a consequence to experience a large surplus on the current account. What is likely to decrease? Floating exchange rate large surplus, which means that there is appreciation. It's increase in the exchange rate. A says the export capitals from the country, which is not correct. B says the level of employment, which is incorrect. C says the price of imports into the country, which is correct because there's a large surplus, meaning that there is an increase in exchange rate. Now the prices of imports would now decrease, making it much cheaper to purchase. D says the value of the country's currency, which is incorrect because there will be an increase in the country's currency. Question 26. Which measure is aimed directly at promoting international trade? So A says decreasing existing quotas. Decreasing the quota meaning that there will be less items that can be sold in the country, which is incorrect. B says increasing interest rates, which means that people will end up just saving money in the bank instead of buying stuff. C says subsidies paid to export industries, which is correct because this will help with international trade. D says wage subsidy schemes during recession, which has nothing to do with international trade. It's just to protect workers, so that's not the answer. So answer has to be C. Question 27. What would be classified as a supply side policy measure? A supply side policy measure would have to be something that is related to long term, using supply side. So if you look at A, it says the law to reduce the power of trade unions, which is correct. B says the reduction in the government's fiscal deficit, this one is under fiscal policy, also known as, which is also part of demand side policy. C says open market sale of securities, which is part of fiscal policy as well. D says the imposition of a tariff on import goods, this is part of protectionism, also not part of supply side policy, so answer has to be A, which is law, which is having a law to protect the country's sales. Answer is, which is to protect, basically a law which is to protect the country by reducing the power of trade unions, which means that the act of the trade union, which is to have only one common external tariff, which would then lower the price of imports, would then be solved by having this particular law in place. Question 28. What is the equilibrium of a country's national debt? National debt meaning that the money that the country overall owe. A would be the accumulated borrowing of the government, which is correct. B says the difference between government spending and taxation, which is incorrect. Because a country's national debt is basically when the government borrows from people instead of using your own money and all those things. And then C, it says the interest paid by the government on all the money it owes, which is incorrect because national debt is basically what you owe, not the interest paid. D says the total money owed by all households, which is incorrect because the money owed by all households does not account to the country's national debt, which is the amount of cash available in the country's accounts, which would have to be A. Okay, for question 29, a country experiences a fall in the value of exports and an increase in the value of imports of goods and services, and what are the effects of these changes? So a country now has a decrease in value of exports, which means that now the exports are now cheaper, but the value itself has decreased, and then there's an increase in the value of imports, which means that your X minus M would now decrease because the value of imports has now increased. So everything else, when there are only these changes, which is fall in value of exports, there will be less aggregate demand because there's an increase in the net exports, decrease in the net exports, and then your balance of payments on goods and services will decrease because there's now more outflow than inflow because of the increase in the value of imports. So answer is B. Alright. For question 30, a government orders its central bank to buy its domestic currency on the foreign exchange markets and believe that this will improve the balance of payments. Okay, so for question 30, right, based on the mark scheme, there is an issue with the question, so we are not going to do this question because it's not you cannot do this question because there's an issue with it. Alright, so this is the end of this paper. I hope you guys find this video helpful. Do share this video out to other people who may need help with economics AS level. As always, I hope to see you guys again in the next video. Till then, this is qiphyedu. Goodbye.